Hi, I am Aurel Enriquez, and this presentation contains our discussion on the integumentary system. Um, from this point forward, I might be sending this lecture both to my lecture classes and to my laboratory classes. So kung kayo po ay nabibilong sa lecture classes ko, I will be pointing out the specific things na dapat nyong i-focus, aralin kapag nagre-review po kayo for our lecture quizzes, lecture exams, and then if you are listening to this and you belong to my laboratory classes, babanggitin ko din po yung mga specific things that you need to focus on for our upcoming graded laboratory activities. Now, the integumentary system not only consists of the skin. Kapag kasi sinabi nating integumentary system, ang una nating naiisip ay yung skin. But listed here are all the other components or structures na kasama sa integumentary system. That would include accessory structures such as the hair, glands, and nails. Okay, so all of these together are included in the integumentary system. As with all my other lectures, mag-focus na lang po tayo dun sa specific areas where I put highlights on. All right, so the appearance of the integumentary system can also indicate physiological imbalances in the body. We'll learn more about that later. Pero basically, ang sinasabi po dito is that depending on the things na kaya nating i-observe sa skin ng pasyente, this may give us an idea on what is going on or what is wrong within the body. Alright? So may mga nangyayari daw sa loob ng katawan ng isang tao na pwedeng ma-observe natin or mabigyan tayo ng clue if we look into their skin. This photo right here shows us the general structure of the skin. Now, if you belong to my laboratory classes, isa rin po ito sa mga bagay na kailangan yung tandaan. So notice that it has three layers, the epidermis, the dermis, and the subcutaneous tissue, which is otherwise referred to as the hypodermis. Okay, so wag din po natin kakalimutan yung mga structures na pwede nating mahanap dito sa mga areas na to, lalong-lalo na sa portions kung nasaan yung dermis and hypodermis. Alright, so there are a lot of different structures that we may find throughout these different layers of the skin. So again, for your laboratory classes, don't forget about these specific parts. Now, let's talk about the functions of the integumentary system. First is protection. So as we can see right here, it could protect against abrasion or pagkagasgas or pagkasugat ng mga internal structures like our muscles or deeper tissues. And it could also protect us from ultraviolet light. So guys, constant exposure and high amounts of ultraviolet light is actually damaging to our cells. UV light can damage the DNA that could be found within our cells. And pag nagka-problema sa DNA, pwede rin po magka-problema dun sa mismong cell division ng mga cells natin. So again, one of the main functions of the skin is to protect against ultraviolet light. But at the same time, lagi po nating tatandaan, no, the skin cannot do all of these things by itself. We need to also kind of help it by using sunscreens or sunblocks, di ba po? Next function is sensation. So the integumentary system has sensory receptors or merong mga nerves or extensions ng nervous system natin, and that is present on our skin. And these are the ones that could help us detect heat, cold, touch, pressure, and pain. So whatever is happening all around us, we're able to sense that, or we're able to detect that because of the receptors that are present on our skin. Next is vitamin D production. So as we can see right here, when our skin is exposed to tiny amounts of ultraviolet light, the skin could produce a molecule that eventually could be transformed to vitamin D. Alright, so nabanggit natin kanina, diba, that ultraviolet light in excessive amounts, no, constant exposure and excessive amounts or very high amounts of ultraviolet ultraviolet light is bad for us, but in small amounts, all right, in regulated amounts, ultraviolet light is also kind of helpful kasi po, ayan, trigger niya yung skin natin na mag-produce ng isang certain molecule at itong molecule nito eventually would become vitamin D. Mamaya mapag-uusapan din natin ano bang pakinabang ng vitamin D at bakit kailangan natin ito in our body. So ayun po, again, that's one of the functions of our skin to help us with vitamin D production. Next is temperature regulation. So the amount of blood flow beneath the skin surface and the activity of sweat glands in the skin both help regulate body temperature. So either, ulitin natin, no? Ang mga factors or ang mga bagay na related sa temperature regulation capability ng skin natin is amount of blood flow and the sweat gland. So the blood flowing underneath our skin and the activity or the production of sweat by our sweat glands, they work together para po ma-maintain yung normal body temperature natin. And for humans, you know that the normal body temperature is around 35 to 37 degrees Celsius, di ba po? So, ayun. Next is excretion. So, small amounts of waste products are lost through the skin and gland secretions. Now, for number 5, function number 5, this one is not very prominent, or it's not really one of the main functions of the skin. There are a lot of other organ systems in our body that is more effective and efficient in eliminating waste products. Pero dito po, sinasabi lang na kahit papaano kaya rin naman ng skin na mag-excrete ng certain amounts of waste products, or at least at a cellular level, it could excrete some waste products. Let's now focus our discussion on the skin. So the skin is made up of two major layers, and that is the epidermis and the dermis, which nakita na po natin kanina dun sa previous slide, diba? Nakita na natin yung two main layers ng skin. All right, so first up is the epidermis. This is the most superficial layer of the skin, meaning ito po yung nasa pinaka ibabaw. So this one is made up of epithelial tissue. All right, epithelial tissue. Now, if you would remember from our past discussions, I'm reminding you, okay, if you haven't watched our previous discussions, you should have already watched our previous discussions dahil medyo marami po akong mababanggit na mga terms or magagamit na mga terms na na-discuss na natin in previous discussions. All right, so again, the epidermis is the most superficial or pinaka-topmost layer ng skin, and this is composed of epithelial tissue. If you would remember from our previous discussions, when we say epithelial tissues, these are the types of tissues that are usually responsible for covering, all right, covering and protecting underlying tissues. The second layer is the dermis. Now, this one is mostly made up of dense connective tissue. Alright? So, kung yung epidermis gawa sa epithelial, yung dermis naman po ay gawa sa connective tissues. And then, as we've seen earlier dun sa previous slide, underneath the dermis is the hypodermis, or otherwise referred to as subcutaneous tissue. Now, do keep in mind though, na wag natin kakalimutan, the hypodermis or the subcutaneous tissue is not actually a part of the skin. Alright? So, kumbaga sinasabi lang natin or ina-acknowledge lang natin yung existence ng hypodermis or yung existence nitong subcutaneous tissue just to give us kind of like a general idea kung nasaan nakalagay, no? Or kung ano yung pagkakasunod-sunod ng mga structures on our skin. All right, but again, if you are being asked what are the layers of the skin, no, it's just the epidermis and the dermis. The hypodermis is not actually a part of the skin. This slide focuses on the different layers of the epidermis. So kanina nabanggit na natin, the epidermis and the dermis exists. Now let us look further or closer into the different layers of the epidermis. Now, as we can see, the topmost layer is referred to as the stratum corneum, underneath that, we have what is known as the stratum lucidum. Okay? And then beneath or sa ilalim po ng stratum lucidum, we have the stratum granulosum, as we can see right here. Next, beneath that, or yung, kumbaga is yung fourth layer na ng epidermis natin, is the stratum spinosum, and then yung pinakailalim is referred to as the stratum basale. And then after that, or sa ilalim nito, dun na magsisimula yung dermis. Okay? So, ayan po. Again, if you belong to my laboratory classes, huwag kakalimutan itong layers ng skin na to. If you belong to my lecture classes, abangan mamaya as we proceed with the discussion, there are diseases that is related, or that is kind of like targeted specifically to some of these deeper layers of the epidermis. So we'll learn more about that later. Okay, so let's just further discuss the epidermis. So the epidermis prevents water loss and resists abrasion. Okay, ulitin natin yung dalawang main purpose ng epidermis is to prevent water loss and resist abrasion. So iniiwasan niya na ma-dehydrate yung skin natin, and iniiwasan niya rin po na magasgasan yung skin natin or ma-damage yung skin natin. So the epidermis, known as the cutaneous membrane, okay, ulitin natin yun, ang epidermis ay pwede rin pong tawagin na cutaneous membrane, is a keratinized, stratified squamous epithelium. Now, again, based off from our previous discussions, let's break down these terminologies that was used here. Okay? Kapag sinabi natin keratinized, the epidermis is composed of keratin, which is a type of protein that is capable of hardening some materials, and also it acts as a barrier to prevent water loss. Kapag sinabi naman natin na stratified, it means that there are multiple layers of the cells. Di ba po? There are multiple layers of cells that could be found on the epidermis. And we saw that earlier dun sa previous slide, di ba? Simula stratum corneum hanggang stratum basale. Next, description that was used here is squamous. So, again, if you would remember from our past discussions, ang mga epithelial tissues ay pinapangalanan based on the type of cell that could be seen on the surface, or yung topmost layer or superficial layer. So when we say the epithelium is squamous, most of the cells at the top are flat in shape. So ganun daw po yung description ng epidermis. It is keratinized, stratified, squamous. Now, the epidermis is composed of distinct layers referred to as strata. And yun nga po yung nakita natin sa previous slide kanina. The stratum corneum is the most superficial layer, or the topmost layer of the epidermis, and it is composed of dead squamous cells filled with keratin. Okay, ulitin po natin, yung stratum corneum, yung mga cells dito sa area na to, they're actually dead. Okay, patay na po yung mga skin cells natin sa stratum corneum. Now, the thing about them is that they are filled, or they are put together with keratin. So keratin gives the stratum corneum its structural strength. Okay? So ayan po. Again, also, with the help of keratin, ito po yung nakakatulong para ma-fulfill ng epidermis yung nabanggit natin na functions kanina, which is to prevent water loss and to resist or protect against abrasion or damage. Now, the cells of the deepest strata, or specifically yung stratum basale, tulad na nakita natin kanina dun sa illustration, they're the ones that are capable of performing mitosis. Okay, so again, imagine that diagram that we've seen earlier. Kung yung nasa pinakaibabaw sila yung mga dead skin cells, eventually we would be able to lose them, diba? We would slop them off through different activities like exfoliation, paghihilod, and other stuff like that, diba? So eventually, matatanggal din yung mga dead skin cells na yun. Now, how are they going to be replaced? They will be replaced through mitosis of the deeper-most layers of the epidermis. So, kumbaga, ang nag-undergo ng cell division is yung mga cells ng stratum basale to replace the cells at the top. So eventually, umaangat po pataas yung mga cells na yun, And ayan, it maintains the overall structure and amount of cells that should be there. Let's now talk about some conditions that are happening at the epidermis that might no longer be considered normal. All right, so first up is dandruff. Okay, so excessive sloughing off of the stratum corneum at the scalp is referred to as dandruff. So yung intense or masyadong matindi na pagkaka-peel off or yun nga, sloughing off of the stratum corneum dun sa scalp natin, that is referred to as dandruff. Now, there may be different causes of dandruff. For some people, it may be because of a fungal infection. For some people, it may be because of stress. For some people, it may be a chemical reaction to the products that they're using. But again, the process that is happening is the same. Masyado pong matindi yung pagtuklap no, ng mga stratum corneum dun sa scalp, which is why nagiging dandruff sila or nagkakaroon ng dandruff yung mga pasyente. Next condition is when the skin is subjected to excessive amounts of friction, the number of layers in the stratum corneum greatly increases and this forms a callus. Okay? So kung halimbawa, meron daw tayong area in our body that is constantly subjected to friction, ang mangyayari is kakapal yung normal layer or normal amount ng stratum corneum. So kung hindi naman ganun talaga dapat kakapal yung stratum corneum sa lugar na iyon, ayun nga, mag-a-adjust yung skin cells natin and kakapalan nila yung layer ng stratum corneum more than what is normal. And this would form what is known as callus or in Tagalog, kalyo. Okay, so if for example, you play any instrument. So if anybody here plays the guitar, diba? Usually nagkakaroon kayong kalyo at the ends of your fingertips kung saan ginagamit nyo ito to hold down the strings or make the chords at the fretboard, diba? So, ayun po, that's one of the examples on how you could form a callus. Constant friction on that area, mag-a-adjust yung skin cells natin to thicken up or to increase the number of layers of the stratum corneum. Next, we also have a different terminology that also refers to a callus. Now, if a callus happens over a bony prominent, that cone-shaped structure would now be referred to as a corn. Now, what example could we give for this one? Have anybody here worn a footwear na hindi komportable? Nasubukan nyo namang magsuot ng sapatos or kahit anong footwear na hindi komportable. There are times when we constantly use footwear that is not well-fitting to our feet. Minsan yung gilid ng paa natin or malapit dun sa, kumbaga yung parang pinky toe ng paa natin, dun sa area na yun, kapag laging nagagasgas yun dahil nga hindi tama yung fitting ng footwear natin, since nandun yung structures of our feet, nandun yung bones of our feet, at nagkaroon ng kalyo doon, that would now be referred to as a corn. Kasi other than the fact na makapal na nga yung stratum corneum sa area na yun, yun nga, meron pang excess projection ng bones dun sa lugar na yun, making them look like they're cone-shaped or making them look like they're more prominent than they're supposed to be. So basically, ang corn po is also a type of callus. It's just that it's placed in an area that has a more bony projection or nasa ibabaw siya ng area kung saan prominent yung bones natin. That was for the epidermis. Let's now talk about the dermis. So the dermis is composed of dense collagenous connective tissue. Alright? So ulitin po natin, rewind lang. Kapag sinabi nating epidermis, the epidermis is composed of keratinized, stratified, squamous epithelium. Ngayon, dito naman sa dermis, it is composed of dense collagenous connective tissue. Aside from that, pwede din po tayo makita dito sa dermis ng fibroblasts, adipocytes, and macrophages. Alright, fibroblasts, they're, as the name implies, no, they're capable of creating fibers within this connective tissue. Adipocytes, these are our fat cells, and macrophages, these are the types of cells capable of fighting off foreign materials or infectious organisms. Right? Dito sa dermis, pwede rin po tayo makahanap ng nerves, hair follicles, smooth muscles, glands, and lymphatic vessels. Alright? So, maraming composition, no? Maraming different structures na pwedeng makita within the dermis. Now, it also says here, in terms of the collagen fibers, they are oriented in many directions. So, wala daw pong specific na direction yung pagkakaayos ng mga collagen fibers. We also have elastic fibers within our dermis, and they are responsible for the structural strength of the dermis and the resistance to stretch. So although our skin is kind of like flexible, we could move it around without our skin tearing or hindi basta-basta nasusugat or napupunot yung skin natin, no? There's also a minimal amount of stretch. So kaya nating hatakin ng konti yung skin natin and it would be totally fine. So ayan po, that's also because of the elastic fibers and collagen fibers that are present in our skin. As we can see right here, sabi po dito, some collagen fibers are oriented in more directions than others. May mga collagen fibers daw po na medyo mas maraming direction or kumbaga in simpler terms, medyo mas magulo yung arrangement nila and they have the capability to form cleavage lines. So cleavage lines, otherwise referred to as tension lines, are areas in the skin that are more resistant to stretch. Alright? So, dahil daw po sa arrangement nila, no, na yun nga, walang specific direction na, kumbaga parang pinatutunguhan or walang specific na direction kung saan naka-arrange or walang specific direction na sinusunod yung mga collagen fibers dahil doon, no, they are more resistant to stretching, or that's kind of like kumbaga, dahil wala silang specific direction na sinusunod, it's an advantage. Kasi nga po, ayan po, they are more resistant to stretching. And in a surgical perspective, all right, in a surgical perspective, incisions that are made parallel to these lines would tend to gap less and produce less scar tissue. Okay? So, ulitin po natin yung mga statements na nabanggit. If there are some areas in our skin kung saan the collagen fibers are arranged or oriented in many different directions compared to others. So that would be referred to as areas that have tension lines. And yung mga areas that have tension lines, if for example, incisions or injuries would happen in these areas, less scar tissue would be produced. Hindi daw very, or we wouldn't expect, no, na magkaka-scar or magkakaroon ng peklat dito sa mga specific areas na to. Alright? Let's look at that on the next slide. Okay, as we can see right here, if for example, this is the tension line, alright? If we make an incision or if for example, masusugat yung person in a direction na hindi nakaayon dun sa tension line, maaari daw po or mas mataas yung chance na mag-scar dito sa area na to. On the other hand, if we were to make an incision or for example, accidentally masusugat yung person in a line or in a direction that is parallel to those tension lines or cleavage lines, it is less likely daw po na magkaroon ng scarring yung person dun sa specific area niya. Alright? It might be difficult to understand for now kasi po usually yung mga surgeons or maybe yung mga plastic surgeons lang naman yung may main concern kung nasaan yung tension lines ng mga pasyente nila. But ayun po, that's just the general idea of tension lines or cleavage lines. Let's now talk about the dermal papillae. So these are curves or projections towards the epidermis at the upper part of the dermis. So may mga curves daw po or projections yung dermis na nakaturo pataas papunta sa epidermis. The important thing that we have to remember here is that the curves and ridges of the dermal papillae are the ones that is responsible for creating our fingerprints and footprints. Alright, so ulitin po natin, meron tayong fingerprints, meron tayong footprints because of the structure of our dermal papillae. Again, what is a dermal papillae? These are the projections or extensions upwards or towards the epidermis. Let's now talk about skin color. So the factors that determine skin color include pigments, the blood that is circulating through the skin, and the thickness of the stratum corneum. Now the two primary pigments are melanin and keratin. Okay, so ayan po. First up is melanin. So melanin is a group of pigments that is primarily responsible for skin, hair, and eye color. So mamaya malalaman natin bakit tinawag na group of pigments. What does the term group of pigments mean? Basically, it means that melanin is not just one color. Okay? Hindi iisang kulay lang po ang melanin. We'll talk more about that in the next slide. But first, let's talk about keratin. So keratin, this one is a yellow pigment found in plants such as squash and carrots. Alright? So ayan po. Again, carotene, no? Again, it's a yellow or orangey pigment na usually pwede nating mahanap sa mga plants. Let's now talk about melanin. So melanin molecules are usually brown or black, alright? Kadalasan, ang mga melanin components na nakikita natin are brown or black. Pero, pwede rin naman pong maging yellowish or reddish ang melanin, alright? This is why we're able to observe people with different skin tones. Alright, so there are people out there na medyo mas yellowish yung color ng skin nila. There are people out there na medyo parang mas reddish or mas mapula yung itsura ng skin nila. This is also attributed to the presence of melanin. Alright, pero ayun nga po, hindi ang tawag dito, parang hindi natin ito masyadong napapansin kasi nga most of the melanin molecules that we are observing are either brown or black. Let's now talk about the function of melanin. So, kanina nabanggit natin sa main functions ng skin is to protect against ultraviolet light, di ba po? Now, we know na ang nagbibigay pala sa skin natin ng capability to protect against UV light is the melanin components, alright? So, kaya daw po nagkaroon ng kakayahan yung skin natin na protektahan tayo or parang bigyan tayo ng shield against UV light is because of the presence of melanin. Okay? So, saan ba nanggagaling ang melanin? Melanin is produced by melanocytes that are then packaged into vesicles that are referred to as melanosomes. Okay? Ulitin natin, ang melanin ay kinecreate or ginagawa ng mga cells na ang tawag ay melanocytes. Now, these melanocytes, they're capable of distributing or secreting the melanin once they have packaged them or kapag nailagay na nila sa container. Okay? So, itong mga container na to na may laman na melanin, we would refer to them as melanosomes. Okay, so the epithelial cells would then phagocytize the tips of the melanocyte cell, thereby acquiring the melanosome. So basically, ang nangyayari daw po, yung mga melanocytes or yung mga cells na nag-create ng melanin, no, para po ma-distribute nila yung melanosomes nila or maipamigay nila yung melanosomes nila sa mga epithelial cells. Yung mga epithelial cells daw po, they have to phagocytize or kumbaga, kukuha sila ng piraso ng melanocyte para ma-acquire nila yung melanosomes na nasa loob na nagko-contain ng melanin. Alright, so that is how melanin is distributed throughout our skin. This slide right here shows us an illustration of the process that we talked about in the previous slide. So kung ito daw po yung stratum basale natin, right here in the middle of all these stratum basale cells are the melanocytes. Now again, ang trabaho po nila ay mag-produce ng melanin. And para ma-distribute nila yung melanin na to, kailangan i-package muna nila ito into vesicles that are referred to as melanosomes. Or in these illustrations, yung nakikita natin na color red-orange na mga circles or yung mga tuldok-tuldok. Alright? And para ma-distribute daw po ito sa mga cells natin or sa mga epithelial cells natin, what would happen is the epithelial cells would have to take a piece of the melanocyte and engulf or ingest those pieces or extensions of the melanocyte. So these pieces would now contain the melanosomes, and then, ayun po, doon nila ma-acquire yung melanin. Alright, so I hope you were able to understand that better through this illustration. Still on skin color, large amounts of melanin can form freckles or moles. Alright, so may mga specific areas daw po sa skin natin kung saan nag-accumulate doon, no, yung large amounts of melanin. Yun po yung na-observe natin as freckles or moles or mga nunal. Now, melanin production is determined by genetic factors plus exposure to light and some hormones. All right, so genetic factors. So kumbaga, this is something that could also be inherited throughout your family. So if in your family, karamihan po sa inyo ay maputi, it is expected na magiging maputi din kayo. So hindi masyadong active yung mga melanocytes, no? On the other hand, if common po sa family ninyo yung pagkakaroon ng dark skin, it is expected, no, that you will also have dark skin because ayun na, nagtatrabaho ng mabuti yung mga melanocytes ninyo. Another thing that was mentioned here is exposure to light. Now, ulitin natin, ano yung isa sa mga pakinabang ng melanin for production against UV light. So if we're constantly exposed to light, specifically sunlight, ayun po, matitrigger din or mapupush din na mas magtrabaho yung mga melanocytes natin to produce more melanin because we are constantly exposed to light. So even if, for example, genetically maputi yung family ninyo, genetically maputi ka, if you're constantly exposed to sunlight, then your melanocytes will also have to work harder to protect you against UV light by producing more melanin, making your skin a bit darker. Next, ayan po, as we can see right here, genetic factors are also responsible for the amounts of melanin produced in different races. So notice that, ayun nga, depending on our race, nag-iiba-iba din po yung skin color natin. So Caucasians are more white, Asians have a bit more yellow undertone in terms of our skin color. Although for us Filipinos, diba, medyo wide range na rin yung skin color na pwede natin ma-observe. There are a lot of Filipinos that have deeper or darker skin tones. There are a lot of Filipinos that have a more fair or lighter complexion. But one thing is common. We have a very yellow skin tone or kind of like undertone in our skin, which again, responsibilidad din po or kumbaga is parang kagagawan din ng melanin yung ganong klaseng appearance ng skin natin, diba? So ayan, genetically, it has been determined na most of us, if we are Asian, this is what our skin composition or melanin composition of our skin will be. For those African Americans, no, it is expected that they have a more reddish and deeper or darker skin tone. So again, that's a genetic thing and a race-related kind of characteristic. So that's what we mean when we say genetic factors across different races. Now, let's look at the statement right here. All races have about the same number of melanocytes. Lahat daw po tayo, whether you are Caucasian, Asian, African American, lahat daw tayo ay may magkakaparehas na number of melanocytes. Alright? Hindi porket mas maitim ang isang person ay mas marami na siyang melanocytes. Alright? But the variations in skin color are determined by the amount, the kind, and distribution of melanin. Okay, so ulitin natin. The amount of melanocytes in our skin is the same regardless of race. Ang pinagkaiba lang po is yung amount, gaano kadaming melanin ang pinoproduce ng melanocytes ng isang person na to. Gaano kakonti yung melanin na pinoproduce ng melanocytes ng person na to. Again, that has something to do with the yellowish or reddish undertone of the skin and distribution of the melanin. So ayan po, again, I hope hindi kayo na-confuse dun sa statement na yun. Ulitin natin, i-simplify natin, lahat tayo, kahit ano pa ang race or nationality natin or ethnicity natin, we probably have the same amount of melanocytes. It's just that melanocytes of other people from other places are producing more melanin, or they are producing a different undertone or pigment of melanin. Ito po ay nabanggit na natin kanina, exposure to ultraviolet light or sunlight could stimulate melanocytes and increase melanin production, leading to people developing darker skin tones. Next, genetically, there could also be mutations that could happen. So a single mutation can prevent the production of melanin, and this could cause albinism. So sa cases po ng mga person with albinism, although they have melanocytes, their melanocytes aren't working. Yung melanocytes nila ay hindi nagpo-produce ng melanin. So, ang nangyayari, their skin is white, their hair is white, even the hairs on their eyebrows, lashes is white, and sometimes even their eyes. Maski yung eyes po nila ay walang pigment. So it kind of looks like they just have like a reddish like pupils, or reddish area in the middle of their eyes. Hindi katulad natin na may mga variations with our eye color. So some of us have a really dark brown eye color. Some of us have a hazel eye color. Yung iba sa atin ay may bluish na eye color. Again, that has something to do with the amount of melanin on our eyes. Pero for people with albinism, wala talaga. So red lang yung nakikita natin because of the blood vessels that are present on their eyes. So ayan, again, that is brought about by a genetic mutation. Let's now talk about carotene. As humans, we don't produce carotene. And carotene po ay nanggagaling sa mga plants that we consume. Okay, again, an example or the most well-known example of source of carotene are carrots. Okay, so ayan po. Carotene, this is a lipid-soluble molecule that when consumed, it could accumulate in the stratum corneum and at the adipocytes of the dermis and hypodermis, or yung subcutaneous tissue. So kung kakain daw po tayo ng mga pagkain that contains large amounts of carotene, then eventually pwede daw pong ma-accumulate yung carotene dun sa mga areas ng stratum corneum natin, sa areas ng dermis and subcutaneous tissue, which could give us kind of like a bit more yellowish appearance. All right, so as you can see right here, large amounts of carotene on the skin can make us look a bit yellowish. This specific slide talks about the contribution of our blood flow to the appearance of our skin. So color of the blood in the dermis contributes to skin color. Now, if there is decreased blood flow, in cases of shock, so if, for example, any type of shock, actually, hypovolemic shock or the loss of blood, that type of shock, or emotional kind of shock, all right? So, ayan po, that could lead to our skin having a decreased amount of blood flow, making us look pale. Okay, again, explain natin yung dalawang magkaibang scenario na sinabi ko, or yung dalawang types ng shock na nabanggit ko just now. When we say hypovolemic shock, there's literally less amount of blood flowing through our system. All right, so kumonti daw po, nabawasan yung blood within our circulation. So less blood is flowing through our skin, making us look pale. Now, in another case, if for example, we're emotionally shocked, in cases of times kung saan halimbawa tayo ay nagulat ng matindi or natakot, di ba? Pag natatakot tayo or kinakabahan tayo, namumutla tayo. So ayun, that's another form of shock. Now, both types of shock could lead to the appearance of pale skin. And that's simply because there is a decrease in blood flow on the surface of our skin. Next, decreased amount of oxygen could lead to a bluish color referred to as cyanosis. So ito naman po, kahit na sapat yung dami ng dugo na meron tayo, kahit po wala tayong emotional shock na pinagdadaanan, pwede itong mangyari kung yung mismong oxygen level sa dugo natin ay mas mababa compared sa normal. Now, kung dito, sa decreased blood flow, maputla lang yung itsura, dito naman po, if there is decreased oxygen content, this would now give us a kind of like bluish color to our skin, and that is referred to as cyanosis. Let's now talk about skin cancer. This is the most common cancer that is known to man, and this is mainly caused by excessive UV light exposure. Emphasis on excessive. Nabanggit natin kanina, di ba? Okay lang or small amounts of UV exposure is fine because this could also stimulate vitamin D production. Pero yun nga, constant and excessive ultraviolet light exposure could cause skin cancer. Fair-skinned people are more prone to skin cancer, okay? Yung mga mas maputi na person daw po, they have a higher chance of having skin cancer. Bakit? Ulitin natin, it's the melanin that protects us from UV light. So kung kakaunti lang yung melanin sa skin ng person, we would be able to observe that by them having a light skin. So since kakaunti lang yung substance na nagpo-produce sa kanila, or nagpo-protect sa kanila, sorry. If konti lang yung substance na nagpo-protect sa kanila against ultraviolet light, then they may be more prone to damage caused by UV light. And again, that could lead to skin cancer. So skin cancer could be prevented by limiting sun exposure and using sunscreens. Okay, so ulitin natin. Although ang skin natin is capable of producing melanin, alright, although melanin is capable of protecting us from ultraviolet light, kailangan din nito ng konting tulong, which is why we have to use sunscreens, no? Every time we go out, lalong-lalo na if we will constantly be exposed to sunlight. Now, let's look at the different types of ultraviolet lights or ultraviolet rays and kung anong kaya nilang idulot sa atin. UVA or ultraviolet A rays could cause a tan and is associated with malignant melanoma. Okay, so huwag kakalimutan, causative agent of skin tanning and malignant melanoma is UVA. And UVB naman po, these are the ones that could cause sunburns. So typically, the sunscreens that are available in the market, they should be able to block both UVA and UVB. So on this slide, let's now talk about the different types of cancer. First up is the basal cell carcinoma. As the name implies, the cells that are mainly affected are at the stratum basale. Next is the squamous cell carcinoma. In comparison to the one that we first mentioned, ang pinaka-affected daw po na cells are the cells above the stratum basale. Alright, ulitin po natin. Basal cell carcinoma, the cells affected are at the stratum basale. Squamous cell carcinoma, ang cells that are mainly affected are those that are above the stratum basale, or as the name implies, yung mga cells that are now flattened in appearance. Next is malignant melanoma. These ones arise from melanocytes. Okay, so ang main types of cells that are affected by malignant melanoma is yung mga melanocytes, or the cells that are responsible for producing melanin. Okay, malignant melanoma is actually quite rare, but this could be very fatal. So this could lead to death. These photos right here shows us the main characteristics of skin cancer. Now, in terms of assessing skin cancer or giving us an idea kung posible bang skin cancer na yung na-observe natin, we have what is known as the ABC characteristics. A stands for asymmetry. So kung titignan po natin itong mga pictures na to, they're very asymmetric. Meaning, if we were to split them in half, the left side and the right side actually don't match, or they're not kind of like very similar in shape. Okay, so that's the first criteria to assessing skin cancer. Asymmetry, meaning hindi pantay yung itsura nila if hypothetically you're gonna split the pigmentation in half. Next is B, border. So kung titingnan po natin yung outer edges or yung borders nitong mga lesions na nakikita natin dito, they're very rough, they're very uneven. Okay, so that's another sign of possible skin cancer. And letter C is color. Alright, so pag sinabing color, lalong-lalo na dito sa dalawang images na nakikita natin dito, in these lesions that we're seeing, although iisang area lang siya, magkakaiba yung mga color na na-observe natin. In these areas, dito sa figure na to, there are areas that are black and there are areas that are lighter in appearance. Dito naman po, there are areas that are deep brown, there are areas that are the regular type of mole color na parang chocolate brown, and then there are areas that are a bit too light to look like a mole. So yun po, those are the ABCs of skin cancer. Asymmetry, border, and color. Hindi pantay, hindi even yung borders, and hindi isang color lang yung na-observe natin. Those are the main signs of skin cancer that we may be able to observe. Let's now talk about subcutaneous tissue. Again, mag-focus lang po tayo dun sa mga areas with highlights. Subcutaneous tissue, this is otherwise referred to as the hypodermis, or something that is beneath the dermis, but again, this is not actually a part of the skin. Now, this one would attach the skin to the underlying bones or muscles and blood vessels and nerves. So basically, dinuduktong lang daw po nung hypodermis yung skin natin to everything else underneath, but it's not necessarily a part of the skin. Next, the hypodermis is mostly composed of adipose tissue or fat cells, and these adipose tissues are capable of producing padding and insulation. All right, so they kind of like cushion our skin and the underlying tissues, and insulation, meaning they also kind of like contribute to the capability of our skin to maintain normal body temperature. But again, ang hypodermis ay hindi bahagi ng skin. Let's now talk about hair. So this could be found everywhere except on the palms, soles, lips, nipples, and genitalia. So wala daw po tayong hair sa palad, sa paa, on our lips, no, or the actual skin of our lips. Ha? Syempre, on the outside of that, meron. That's why people could have facial hair or mustache or beards, all right? On the nipples, dun sa mismong pinaka-center ng nipples, it's not normal to have hair on the like centermost area. And of course, there are areas dun sa mismong genitalia, not on the outside or the surrounding areas. Pero yung mismong genitalia, there are areas on that na it's normal to not have hair follicles on those. Kasama rin sa mga areas that don't have hair follicles are the distal segments of the fingers and the toes. So it's quite accurate. If we were to look at the tips of our fingers and our toes right now, wala rin pong hair follicles sa mga areas na yun. Ang makikita lang natin ay yung ating mga fingerprints, diba? And again, just a rewind. Anong structure ang responsible for the creation of fingerprints? It's the dermal papillae, all right? Next, each hair arises from a hair follicle that could be found at the epidermis and would extend deep into the dermis. Now, let's talk about the structure of the hair. It has a hard cortex on the outside, and then on the inside, it has a soft center, which is referred to as the medulla. Okay, ulitin natin. The hair has two areas. The outside is hard and is referred to as the cortex. The inside or the center is soft and it's referred to as the medulla. So the cortex, this is covered by the cuticle. All right, and next, the hair is produced inside of the hair bulb. Okay, so ulitin po natin. There is a specific area on our skin that is referred to as the hair bulb. So dito po nagsisimula yung production ng hairs. Now, the hair papilla, this is an extension on the dermis that protrudes into the hair bulb that contains blood vessels. Alright, so ulitin natin, yung hair papilla, this is an extension, and within that we could find blood vessels, which makes sense. Alright, the blood is the blood is a component of our body that supplies oxygen, nutrients, and other stuff like that. That is very important in the creation of new cells, and that would include hairs. The hair is produced in cycles. We have what is known as a growth stage and a resting stage. So it's a growth stage, to oversimplify the statement said here. So growth stage, the hair is formed by mitosis of epithelial cells. Okay, so ulitin natin, ang hair is also made up of epithelial cells that were produced through mitosis. And ayun nga po, they were also undergoing keratinization. Okay, so yun po yung mga processes that happens during growth stage. Magmamitosis yung mga epithelial cells, and then they would be reinforced with keratin. Next naman po is the resting stage. Stage, no, as the name implies, the growth would stop. Now, depending on the type of hair or where specifically the hair could be found, nag-iiba-iba rin po yung growth and resting stages nila. So, for example, we're talking about the eyelashes. They're capable of growing for 30 days, and then they would stop or rest for about 105 days. That's for the eyelashes. Now, if, for example, we're talking about the hairs on the scalp, they could continue to grow for 3 years and then stop growing for 1 to 2 years. Now, if this is the case, if, for example, 105 days ang resting stage ng eyelashes, bakit hindi nakakalbo yung eyelashes natin? Same for the scalp hairs, no? Kung 3 years silang mag-grow, bakit hindi tayo nakakalbo after 3 years, no? For 1 to 2 years, kung yun yung resting stage nila. That's because the individual hairs on our lashes or on our scalp doesn't really follow the same time of growth and resting stage. All right, so maaaring may specific areas on our lashes or on our scalp na for them ito yung resting stage nila, and para sa iba ito yung growth stage nila. So ayun po, kumbaga is parang since hindi sila magkakaparehas ng schedule, may natitira pa rin tayong hair na continuously nag-grow while there are hairs on our scalp or on our eyelids or eyelashes or eyebrows na nandyan pa rin sila kahit yung ibang hair follicles ay naka-resting stage. Okay, so I hope you were able to understand that explanation. All right, again, we don't totally lose all of our hair at the same time kapag nag-resting stage sila dahil hindi sila magkakaparehas or magkakasabay ng growth and resting stage. Pero ayun nga po, for now, just remember, eyelashes, ang growth stage nila ay 30 days, resting for 105 days. Ang scalp hairs, ang growth stage nila ay 3 years, resting for about 1 to 2 years. But again, it doesn't happen at the same time. This next slide talks about hair color. This is determined by varying amounts and types of melanin. All right, so again, katulad ng skin color natin, ang hair color natin is also determined by melanin. So for us Asians, no, our hair is composed of very large amounts of melanin. So that's why it's very normal for us to have black or brown hair. Now, for other people from other regions like the Caucasians, it's normal for them to have less amounts of melanin on their hairs. Kaya po, they have blonde hair or they have very light brown hair. Now, in other regions in Europe, we have people from Scotland, no, that they have quite orangey or reddish appearance of their hair. And again, that's still brought about by melanin. Pero if you would remember from our discussion earlier, diba, hindi lang naman brown or black ang melanin, diba? It could also be yellow, it could also be red. So ayun po, again, different people of different ethnicities could have different hair colors because of the type and amount of melanin that is present on their hair. Now, as we can see right here, as we age, the amount of melanin decreases, leading to the appearance of white hairs. Kaya daw po pumuputi, no? Pumuputi yung buhok natin ay dahil kumukonti na rin yung melanin production on our hair. Next, hair follicle is attached to smooth muscles. So may smooth muscles daw po, no, sa dermis natin. And ayan po, they are referred to as the arrector pili muscle. So they can contract and cause the hair to become perpendicular to the skin surface. So kung halimbawa tayo ay nilalamig, kung tayo ay natatakot, no, minsan 'di ba, umaangat yung buhok sa skin natin. Again, that happens because of the arrector pili muscle. Right, so this slide right here just shows us the general structure of the hair follicle and the specific structures that make up the hair, as we can see right here. Let's now talk about the glands that could be found on our skin. There are two types, sebaceous and sweat glands. Ang sebaceous glands po, they are simple branch assigner glands that are usually attached to the hair follicle. Now, sebaceous glands po, they produce sebum, which is an oily type of material. Alright, so ulitin natin, yung mga oils na pinoproduce ng skin natin, sila ay produkto ng sebaceous glands. As we can see right here, the purpose of the oils that are produced in the sebaceous glands could lubricate the hair. So, kumbaga, hindi nagda-dry yung buhok natin because of the oils that are produced by the sebaceous glands. Next, the sebaceous glands or the oils that are being produced doon could also protect against some bacteria. Alright? So, there are some bacterial species out there na hindi nila kayang mabuhay in very oily environments. And yun po, that's also something na kayang gawin ng oils na napoproduce ng ating sebaceous glands. Next are sweat glands. So as it says here, there are two types of sweat glands, eccrine and apocrine. So unahin natin pag-usapan yung mga eccrine sweat glands. Alright? So they're usually found at the palms and soles. Okay? So sa mga palad daw natin and sa talampakan, dun tayo usually makakahanap ng eccrine sweat glands. So they produce a secretion that is mostly water and a few salts, all right? And they're usually there for thermal regulation, meaning the regulation of our body temperature. Now, sweat can also be released in the palms, soles, and armpits and other places because of emotional stress, all right? So ayan po. If mapapansin nyo, no, kapag kinakabahan tayo or any form of emotional stress for that matter, we may be able to observe that we are sweating a bit more profusely in comparison to normal. So again, that's something that happens because of our eccrine sweat glands. Next are apocrine sweat glands. So these ones are usually found at the armpits and genitalia. All right, so kung kanina, yung eccrine sweat glands, they're usually at the palms and soles. No? Dito naman po ang apocrine nasa armpits and genitalia. So these ones usually start becoming active during puberty. Now, the secretion of apocrine sweat glands are usually odorless. Pero ano nangyayari? bacterial action is the one that is responsible for giving people body odor. So ulitin natin, wala naman talagang amoy yung sweat that is being produced by apocrine sweat glands. But because we have a normal amount of bacteria on our skin, kapag napabayaan po ng isang person ang kanyang personal hygiene, yung mga bacteria, they overgrow or dumadami sila. And ang nangyayari is they continue to break down or they continue to make use of these substances na pinoproduce ng apocrine sweat glands. Now, yung mga byproducts po, no, yung mga waste materials na napoproduce ng bacteria, yun yung nagiging source ng body odor. Okay, so ayun po. I hope you were able to understand that explanation. Again, apocrine sweat glands, they're usually found at the armpits and at the genitalia. The secretions of apocrine sweat glands don't really have an odor. They're odorless. Ang nagbibigay lang po ng body odor sa mga person is the bacterial action, no? With regards to these products of the apocrine sweat glands. So ayun po, it's very important to maintain personal hygiene to avoid the production of body odor. Here's an illustration of the glands of the skin. Again, if you belong to my laboratory classes, wag po natin kakalimutan, no? Aralin po natin itong mga specific structures na nakikita natin dito sa illustration na ito. Let's now talk about the next accessory structure for our integumentary system, and that is our nails. So the nail is a thin plate that is made up of dead stratum corneum plus a very hard type of keratin. Okay, so ulitin natin, ang nails natin ay gawa sa stratum corneum. Okay, so yung mga cells of our stratum corneum, these are also the same cells that could be found on our nails. Pero yun nga po, it has been reinforced with more and harder structures of keratin. So ayan, the visible part of the nail is the nail body, and then the area that is covered by the skin is the nail root. So yung nakikita natin sa labas, yun yung nail body, yung area ng nail natin na hindi na natin nakikita dahil natatakpan ng skin, that is the nail root. Next, we have what is known as the cuticle or the eponychium. So the eponychium, this is a stratum corneum that extends onto the nail body, and the nail root extends distally from the nail matrix. So ayun na po, wag lang natin kakalimutan that the cuticle is also referred to as the eponychium. At ito po ay gawa rin sa stratum corneum. Next, we have what is known as the nail matrix and the nail bed, or the structures that are beneath the surface or nasa medyo mas looban or ilalim na po ng kuko natin. Those ones are made up of stratum basale. So ulitin po natin, yung nasa labas, it's made up of stratum corneum. Yung nasa gitna at ilalim, they're made up of stratum basale. Next, we have what is known as the lunula. This is the white crescent-shaped area at the base of the nail. So kung titignan niyo po yung kuko ninyo, merong, some of them, they have areas na mukhang may guhit na white or parang may half moon shape na white sa ilalim. So that one is called the lunula. Next, cell production within the nail matrix causes the nail to grow continuously. So ang dahilan daw po kung bakit patuloy na humahaba at nag-grow yung nails natin is because of the cell production that happens sa nail matrix. So kung tatanungin tayo, where does cell production and nail growth happen? It happens at the nail matrix. And so this illustration right here shows us the different areas or the different structures that we've talked about in the previous slide. Ang mga bagay na nakalista dito sa slide na to ay nabanggit na natin kanina, diba? So the integumentary system has the capability to reduce water loss because of the presence of keratin. It acts as a barrier to prevent microorganisms and other foreign substances from entering the body. Dahil, ay nga po, it's literally a physical barrier, isang physical na harang against everything else on the outside. Next, it protects underlying structures against abrasion. So, ayan po. Again, we have our skin para maiwasan yung damage or pagkagasgas ng underlying tissues natin. Next, melanin is there that to absorb ultraviolet light, which again, no, excessive amounts of UV light is damaging to our cells. But again, tulad na nabanggit kanina, in small amounts, this could also encourage vitamin D production. Next, hair protection. So ano yung mga kayang gawin ng hair sa skin natin to protect us from different things. So the hair on our head could act as a heat insulator. So hindi daw po or naiiwasan daw po no yung sobrang accumulation ng init sa yung physical na init ng ulo natin no because of the hairs on our head. Okay? So next, the eyebrows could keep the sweat out of our eyes. So if, for example, you're constantly sweating from your forehead or from your scalp, at least no, nakaharang po yung eyebrows natin para hindi diretsong tumulo sa eyes natin yung pawis. Next, the eyelashes protect the eyes from foreign objects, which this one to me is quite funny because the eyelashes protect the eyes from foreign objects. But a lot of times, kapag tinitingnan nyo, there's a foreign object in your eye, it's usually the eyelashes themselves. So it's kind of like, it's counterproductive to their purpose, no? Iniiwasan ng eyelashes na magkaroon ng mga unnecessary things sa eyes natin. Pero minsan, yung mismong lashes, yung nai-stuck sa mata natin. Next, the hair in the nose and ears prevents the entry of dust and other materials. So meron din pong tiny amounts of hair sa ears natin. And again, ang purpose nila ay para harangan yung mga bagay na hindi nakakapasok sa ears and sa nose natin. Next, the nails protect the ends of our fingers and toes from damage, and they could also be used in defense. Next, very self-explanatory po ang slide na to. Pasimplehin na lang natin. Sensory receptors can be found in the skin. So these receptors may be located at the epidermis and dermis, and they could detect many different things. So they could detect pain, they could detect heat, cold, and pressure para po we would be able to react accordingly to those different things. Next, it also says here that may sensory receptors din daw po sa hair follicles natin that could detect movement. So if, for example, you're not looking at your arm and then suddenly an insect walks by your arm, example, may langgam or may kahit anong insekto na dumapo sa inyo, mararamdaman nyo, di ba? Because they're touching or they're making contact with the sensory receptors at our hair follicles. So kung walang ganon sa hair follicles natin, hindi natin mararamdaman yung mga bagay na nadidikit sa atin and we won't be able to react accordingly. Let's talk about vitamin D production. So UV light causes the skin to produce a precursor molecule for vitamin D. Kapag sinabing precursor molecule, ito yung molecule or ito yung substance na kumbaga is parang simula, no? Ito yung simula para maging vitamin D ang structure na to. So, kumbaga, ito yung building block ng vitamin D. So, this precursor molecule is brought to the liver and it is converted. Okay, so ulitin natin, our skin would be exposed to UV light and then it produces a molecule. This molecule is transported to the liver and then it is converted. Now, pagdating dun sa liver, pagka-convert nitong molecule na to, dadalhin naman niya or ipapasa niya sa kidneys. Pagdating sa kidneys, mako-convert ulit ito and this would now become the active form of vitamin D or yung structure ng vitamin D na functional na mapapakinabangan na natin. Now, ano ba ang pakinabang ng vitamin D? Vitamin D stimulates small intestine to absorb calcium and phosphate for many body functions. So, kailangan daw po natin yung vitamin D para, ayun nga po, para matulungan yung small intestine natin to absorb specific types of minerals. Next, let's talk about temperature regulation. So, chemical reactions within the body can increase or decrease changes in body temperature. Alright? So, ayan po. Kapag hindi stable yung body temperature natin, either kapag masyado tayong nilalamig or kapag, for example, biglang tumaas naman yung body temperature natin kapag nilalagnat tayo, this could affect the enzymes and enzymatic reactions that is happening in our body. So this could make the enzymes operate less efficiently. Okay, so ulitin po natin yung explanation na yun. Kapag daw po nagkaroon ng changes sa body temperature natin, maaapektuhan din nito yung mga enzymes na pinoproduce ng katawan natin, and this could make them less effective. Alright, so examples of this could be exercise, fever, and increase in environmental temperature. So, kapag daw po nag-exercise tayo, nilalagnat tayo, or masyadong mainit sa labas, this could also raise our body temperature. Pwede rin daw pong tumaas or uminit yung body temperature natin above the normal 37 degrees Celsius. So let's talk about temperature regulation. So ayan po, in order to maintain homeostasis, meaning yung normal body temperature natin, the body must rid itself of excess heat. So kung tumataas na daw po yung body temperature natin, the body has to do something to bring that back down to normal. So blood vessels in the dermis would dilate so that more blood flow could go through the skin and cause heat to dissipate. So kapag sinabing dilate, mag-expand or lalapad daw po yung diameter ng blood vessels natin para mas makadalo yung dugo, para po, ayun nga, that could help with the dissipation or elimination of excess heat. Sweat could also help with the loss of heat. So since sweating produces the or kind of like leads to the production of water on the surface of our skin, that could also help with cooling us down. Now, kung kabaliktaran naman, no, if body temperature begins to drop below normal, so kung halimbawa masyado ng malamig, heat can be conserved by the constriction of dermal blood vessels, which would reduce blood flow. So constriction, meaning sisikip or kikitid daw yung daanan ng blood natin para mabawasan yung blood flow. So that's one of the ways on how our body could, ayun nga po, could conserve heat kapag masyado namang malamig. So this diagram right here shows us what it looks like if there is excess heat on our skin and our blood vessels are dilated or malapad sila or kumbaga they widened in diameter. Now, if for example, malamig naman, no, and our body would like to conserve body heat, our blood vessels would constrict or kumbaga liliit yung daanan ng dugo. As I've already mentioned earlier, hindi naman kasama sa primary functions ng skin ang excretion, but in a very very tiny way, in its own tiny way, may capability din po yung skin to perform some form of excretion. So in addition to water and salts, sweat could contain waste products like urea, uric acid, or pneumonia. Alright, so ulitin natin, our sweat could contain things like urea, uric acid, and ammonia. So on a cellular level, kaya rin namang mag-excrete ng mga bagay ng skin natin. But again, as we can see right here, the integumentary system does not play a very significant role in excretion. So again, meron tayong iba pang organ systems na mas effective at mas efficient in excreting waste products. Now, our skin is also very useful in diagnosis because it could easily be observed. So, madali daw pong maobserbahan or madaling makita kung ano yung mga nangyayari sa skin natin. So, that could also help us in the diagnosis of diseases. First up, cyanosis, a bluish color of the skin, could tell us that there is decreased oxygen content in the blood. So, anong implications nito? Maaaring may problema sa circulatory or sa respiratory system ng isang pasyente. Alright, so cyanosis could be a sign, no? Could be a sign that there is something wrong with either the circulatory system or respiratory system of the person. Next, severe yellowish color of the skin is referred to as jaundice, and this could be a sign that there is something wrong with the liver. Next, rashes and lesions in the skin can be symptoms of problems elsewhere in the body. So rashes and lesions, this could tell us na pwedeng merong allergy yung pasyente. Maaari ding ipakita ng mga rashes and lesions na merong dengue yung pasyente. Rashes and lesions may also be observed in some viral or bacterial infections. So maraming iba't ibang bagay, no, na pwede nating maisip kapag nakita natin na may rashes or lesions ang isang pasyente. That could help in the diagnosis of their diseases. So again, these are the things that is readily observable if we just look at the skin of the patient. Let's now talk about burns. Okay, so again, maraming statements na nabanggit dito, pero i-focus natin dun sa pinakamahalaga. When we say first degree burn, this one is superficial kasi ang involved lang ay ang epidermis. Okay, ulitin natin, first degree burn, this is superficial and only involves the epidermis. Next are second degree burns. Now, this is referred to as partial thickness burns. So, dito po ang involved na is yung epidermis and yung dermis. Okay, ulitin natin. Sa second degree burn, this is referred to as partial thickness. Dito po, ang na-damage or ang nasira na is the epidermis and the dermis. Next are third degree burns, alright? So dito naman po, this is referred to as full thickness burn. So dito po, there is complete damage to the epidermis and dermis. So kung kanina sa second degree, partial lang yung damage, hindi ganun kalala yung pagkasira ng epidermis and dermis. Dito po, sunog talaga yung buong epidermis and dermis ng person. So that's what it's like kapag third degree burn. Now, in cases of second-degree burns, since partially damaged lang naman po yung epidermis and dermis, it could regenerate new skin cells from the hair follicles and from the sweat glands dun sa edges of the wound. So, kung halimbawa may specific area lang na nasunog, yung mga skin cells daw po sa paligid, they could close off that wound and repair the area in cases of second-degree burns. Now, in cases of deep partial thickness and full thickness burns, these ones would take a longer time to heal and they could form scar tissue. So dito po sa mga deep partial thickness and full thickness burns, hindi na kaya ng skin cells na i-repair yung area na nasira. So this one is disfiguring, no? So pwedeng masira talaga nito yung appearance nung nasunog na area, and this could lead to debilitating wound contractures or yung mga areas kung saan po talagang nagbago na yung structure, appearance, and nasira na rin yung function ng skin ng patient. This diagram right here shows us the depth or intensity of partial thickness burns. Pag first degree, epidermis lang yung apektado. Kapag second degree, hanggang dermis nasunog. Pag sinabing full thickness, hanggang hypodermis or yung subcutaneous tissue po is nasunog. Let's now talk about some of the things na pwede nating maobserbahan sa skin ng mga tao as they are aging. So blood flow decreases and skin becomes thinner because of the decreased amount of collagen. So habang tumatanda daw po yung tao, kumukonti din yung collagen production. So that leads to much thinner skin. Next, there is decreased activity of sebaceous and sweat glands. So hindi na daw po masyadong active yung sweat glands na nagpo-produce ng fluids and yung sebaceous glands na nagpo-produce ng oils. Next, there's also a loss of elastic fibers. Now, ang problema kapag po nababawasan na yung elastic fibers natin, dito na nagsisimula yung sagging and wrinkling of the skin. So, yung mga lines and wrinkles, yung mga pagbaba ng skin natin, yun po, that is brought about by the loss of elastic fibers. So these are some of the things that we may be able to observe during aging. That ends our discussion on the integumentary system. I am Aurel Enriquez. Thank you so much for listening.